Hello, and welcome to the Vlogging Pod. Tonight, we are joined by Gwen Tolios. And as all my listeners know, I suck on pronunciation, so I hope I did a good job.
You were absolutely fine.
Awesome. Wonderful. I wrote it out as you gave it to me to make sure I did not flub that up.
Yeah, it is a Greek name, and I know sometimes that can be hard. But you did great.
Awesome. Wonderful. Now, your journey from teaching to writing is quite intriguing. How has your background as a teacher influenced your approach to storytelling and character development?
Well, to start, I might need to back up a little bit because I feel like my teaching experience is very unconventional. My
Mm,
teaching experience where I started was actually as a substitute teacher, where I did actually a lot of special education classes. So
mhm,
they would put me into rooms where I was, to be frank, less of a teacher and more of sort of a playmate for students. So, and a lot of kids had communication issues, and so learning how to clearly work with those students was very helpful. And then I actually went from there into the Peace Corps, where I was a education volunteer. So once again, I'm working with a lot of students and in some cases teachers where communication in English wasn't super comfortable, wasn't super familiar to who I was working with. And it meant that I had to really break down what I was trying to teach people. What's the core components of this? How can I make it very simple and easy to understand? What is going to capture the attention of my students? And then taking that into my writing. I've gotten actually a lot of people have mentioned that I write very tightly. And I think that's part of my teaching experiences because I'm used to communicating with people who don't really like the long flowing sentences. It's harder for them to understand. So tight prose, getting to the point of what my stories are, because I am a short story writer versus a novelist, I think has definitely been helpful. And now when I am teaching, it's a little easier because I tend to teach like publishing classes and how to write, usually with the local libraries. And, English, everyone knows English in those situations. But it's that same kind of desire of making things simple so people can understand and doing more of that 101 level education.
hmm. Now, we do have that in common. I do like tight, tight writing is too. I'm sorry, but I get lost if you give me a whole chapter on how the sky looked. I mean, you just lose me.
Yeah.
And so I'm like that too. But I am very much if you like me or you hate me. There's really no middle ground in my writing, and that's fine. I write because I enjoy doing it, and I get excited about what the story's going to end up, even you know what I mean, as I'm writing it.
Oh, yes, for
So,
sure.
and I do write all short stories too. I'm a novella girl from heart. I love a novella. I love now. I'll be honest with you. I'm a hypocrite because when I read your books, I like the longer books, but when I write, I like the shorter. But if I read a shorter, like if read the novellas, I like
Mhm.
for there to be an entire series so that it's extended. And again, I haven't finished all my series, so I'm a big hypocrite. So
No, it's all good. I don't get that, right? So I actually have one novel out, but most of what I have is really short fiction. Half of my collections, I would say, are actually filled with flash fiction. So that
mm.
very short type of writing. Uh and like I'm like I feel like I have a maybe novella floating around. I'm actually hoping to not go the indie route and see if I can get that traditionally published. But I'm finding it hard because a lot of people don't want to publish something traditionally that's 48 to 50,000 words, which is like right
Yeah.
there on that cusp, right, of novella with it to novel. But we'll see what happens.
I feel you. I be honest with you, excuse me, in my very early days, I did not think that I could write a full novel. So when the first book that I wrote was only like 15,000 words. And don't get me wrong, okay, I started out, I published it, and each book in that series got longer and longer. And my my end thought was that all of them were gonna go into one book so that it would be this big, massive book. And that is what I did. I did do that. But in the very beginning, I did my husband encouraged me, and I did have a book, excuse me, that sat on the shelf for a couple years, and I just never went back to it. I mean, I ended up going back to it, but at the time, I just never thought that I was good enough to publish a whole big book, you know what I mean? I was like, I don't have the fortitude, I don't have the strength to to write one of these massive novels,
Oh, right?
and
You have to
yeah,
put so
because
many
I'm
things in your head for a novel, and that can just be difficult.
right?
I'm not a plotter.
No, no. I started out as a plotter. I started out with the whiteboards and the Post-it notes all over it. And then it became where I just started out with a premise. And as I started to write, my characters and all that developed. Now, speaking of that, before I get
Mhm.
too
Oh,
far
yeah, yeah.
ahead, when we were talking here, and part of the question I asked you was about your character development as a teacher, and you just said you weren't a plotter. So tell me how that works in correlation with character development when you're creating your stories.
So for character development, one of the things that I always like to do, I don't think it's necessarily impacted by me being a teacher versus me just having met a lot of people. And so I tend to
Mhm.
pick things from whoever I might have been engaging with. And the only thing that I am probably plotting in a story is actually that character arc. So I always have a starting place for my character and an ending place for my character. I don't really necessarily care about the plot, right? So if I want to take a character from someone who is feeling very isolated and then have the story be them finding connection, how I get there doesn't really matter what the individual plot points are as long as I'm okay, this is where I want her or him to go. And then so I think from a character development standpoint, then I'm really focusing on who might I have met as a teacher or anything else that I'm doing, like just like walking around town or family stories. There's lots of family lore uh, that I could use to kind of enrich my character so it's not just one dimensional. I do want to make sure that there's multiple elements to them and giving them that journey and being able to change the character as I go through, I think is very important for character development.
Right. It's interesting that you say that you don't care so much about the plot, that you're building your character. So when you're writing, if the plot isn't you do have a premise, right? I mean, for what you're going on. Yes.
Yes and no, it depends, and it really, and that's part of the joy of doing, like, short story writing. You could have a vibe that you're going with, a premise, maybe you do just have this core idea, a story that I'm working on right now. So on my Substack, I have a loosely serial where I'm rewriting Grimm's fairy tales as local urban fantasy stories, and the one that I'm currently
Mm,
working on is Rumpelstiltskin. But the only thing that I knew going into this was what my analysis of that fairy tale is, which is someone is giving an impossible task and they're in this sort of bet situation with Rumpelstiltskin. From there, I just kind of took off. So in that case, I did have a basic plot because I'm following the fairy tale, but
mhm,
that's all I had was like, there's a task, it needs to be completed, and she guesses the name. Like, that's it. And then
mhm.
I just go.
I
Um,
like how freely you approach that. Like I said, I used to do the plotting. I did it in
mhm.
my very I think, like, the first book and the first series, but after that I've written 15, but don't get too impressed. Anyways,
Not good.
I've written 15, but it's for the joy of what I wanna write, you know what I mean? Not if I hit someone who really likes it, then that is an accomplishment, you know, that's a
Oh,
success story.
for sure. Like,
Um,
if you look at what I've written, it's also kind of all over the board because it's fantasy
yes.
and it's science fiction and it's
Mm.
romance. And I don't know if you found this poking around on my website, but I also have like one nonfiction title under a different pen name. So I really just kind of write what I want. But that's just sort of how it goes.
You know, you're sort of, like, looking at a glass of myself, and I don't know if that's a compliment or an insult to either one of us,
I think it just
because
means that we can be good friends.
okay. Okay. I find it interesting because I have a pen name too that I wrote some cheesy romances on.
I've also done that. Yeah. I actually manage
Yeah.
3 pen names. One's just the erotica stuff. One's the nonfiction, and then Gwen is where everything else goes. But like I said, that science fiction and contemporary and romance
Yep.
and
Mhm.
whatever, I feel like writing because I do tend to write for the joy and in some cases that joy of discovery. That's why I really
Right.
don't plot. Like I don't know if you've heard that term discovery writer, but it's where you really just discover the story as you're writing. That's the fun part to me.
Wow, I've
Um
been ahead of myself. I've been ahead of my game for years and didn't even know it. 'Cause I absolutely love that, because I love not knowing the ending. Because to me, it's like reading that exciting book and like, "Oh, where's this going?" Because I don't actually know, because the writing and the characters lead me, and just like what you were saying with character development, my characters grow as the book grows, and then I'll
mhm.
highlight passages and put it in a document that's sitting right next to what I'm writing on the screen. I usually have 2 or 3 screens, like, even in my sound booth, I have 4 screens open to me right now, but I love to have that and then just add as I go so that my character grows as the book grows, as the
Yes.
story evolves.
Yes. Yes.
So, yeah, and I have written science fiction as well. I have 2 books in that, and I love I actually, like I said, I don't know if it's a compliment or an insult for you, but but it's like looking in a mirror on that aspect. So, as 2 people, and
Mm.
we both written across genres, and as you've written across genres from fantasy to ghost stories to romance, and in what you said, science fiction as well, what draws you to explore such a wide range, and how do you decide which genre best fits the story idea?
Good gracious. This is a really hard question.
I
Um,
know.
so for so sometimes it depends on what that kernel of an idea is. I tend to hang out a lot on the internet and social media, and so if I'm seeing and part of that involves following a few handles that do prompts. And so in cases like that, right, if they're sparking a story idea, they are very specifically like a science fiction prompt or a fantasy prompt, and so I will do that. The other thing that I have noticed is it will depend on what I am currently consuming. If I've been reading a lot of fantasy books lately, I'm more likely to write something fantastical. Sometimes, if what I want to address is an issue, then I tend to lean a little more actually either historical or contemporary. If I really want to, if I'm being inspired by something that I see or want to change in the modern world, that's where that will come from. And some of it, I will also admit, is a tiny bit ready to market, whether that's an anthology that I see an open call for, and I'm like, "Oh, okay, this is fantasy, let me write this." Or it's knowing the fact that on my social media, I tend to get a lot more engagement from my fantasy stuff.
Hmm.
So, it's kind of a mixed bag versus what I'm doing, but some people do prefer my science fiction versus my fantasy. Some people only know me for my one romance novel. So it's kind of like it's sort of whatever, but I just feel like I'm inspired by so many things and I read widely. I do a lot of things. I'm always looking for new experiences and adventures. And so part of that is also just writing different things, changing it up for a bit.
Right. Now, we both mentioned, well, I'm also independently
Mhm.
published. So, being independently published, you have several titles. What has been the most rewarding and challenging aspects of self-publishing in today's literary landscape?
So the most challenging, I think, is just getting people to buy your book, but I wouldn't necessarily say
Yeah.
that is unique to indie publishing. I
Mhm.
know people who have done indie publishing, and I know people who have done traditional, and I have been published both with and without the support of a small press. And in both cases, that getting people to buy your book, which comes down from the marketing, right? You have to talk about yourself, and I'm an introvert. I don't mind chatting to people, but, like, being on my socials all the time, "Buy my book, buy my book." I'm like, "Oh, no." So, that I think has been really challenging is just doing that awareness and that marketing. especially as an indie person, right? You don't really have you have some support behind you. Like in the case where I went through small presses, they had some things that could help out, but not a whole lot compared to what I'm doing by myself. And it's the long draw of it. So you constantly have to do it. You're not just marketing around the launch if you want to keep your sales up. The most rewarding, I think, is actually just getting my work out there. I've had some I feel like I'm starting to build a fan base. I have been publishing for about 2.5 years now. So there have been times where people have now come to see me, like at a local author fair, and I've been asked, like, hey, I really liked this book or this story of yours. What's very similar? And I could offer them another title. I've had actually had people show up not to buy anything, but with just copies that they already had for me to autograph. And I was like, oh my God. So but once again, I feel like that's not necessarily separate from traditional publishing. What's nice about indie publishing, though, is I feel like I can get it to people sooner. I can get that message out and the stories out to people within 6 months versus a year, which I do appreciate.
Yeah. Well, when you speak about introvert, I had a doctor's appointment a couple days back, and as I was making my appointment, I said, "Well, I tried to use your website to make my appointment because I don't like being on the phone," and I said, "The horrible thing about this is that I run a podcast, and I don't like being on the phone." So, I get your introvert sentiment, but in the same aspect, I can have a conversation with someone in the grocery line, you know what I mean? Like a full story and
Oh,
a full
for
you know what I
sure.
mean?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But
But
it's
it
like,
just depends.
yeah,
Go
it
ahead.
I was gonna say it depends, but then also it's I actually was talking about this on with I was part of a convention that had a writers track in February. And this is actually a topic that had come out talking to a lot of people is like even right now on a podcast, you're being social. This is Gwen's a pen name. This is a little bit of a persona where I'm making myself be sociable because it's not my natural inclination. I'm like, I'm here to talk. I'm here to like meet new people. Let's do this. But I do have to sort of prepare myself for it. You know, like do a little bit of research, like, okay, this is what's happening. This is like my activity for the day. Because I just, again, need that sort of psych up moment. I don't mind doing it. It's just not natural for me.
Right. I feel you on that. I don't know. I think for myself, I'm probably quite a I can just tell from the sound of your voice and your history, I'm probably a lot older, and that's fine.
I mean, maybe. I'm
Oh,
in my mid
I would
30s, so
I'm in my 50s, so I know
okay,
I
not that far.
am. I have nieces and nephews your age. So for me, when I first started, writing, and I think I pulled back, I was more involved and with my you know what I mean, your platform and all that, and I pulled back only because you know how you got so excited for every review you got, and you get
Mm,
so emotionally invested, and it can be world crushing on those first reviews, you know, they either love you or totally hate you. So
yes.
I think I pulled back a lot after that, and then I only started writing for myself, and if it appeased to someone, then you know what I mean, then I got more involved with it. For me, it is turned I'm very different as a writer, and I don't say that for someone to go Google me to find out, because I used to say I was the unorthodox author, and I didn't realize I was until I started getting the reviews, and I
Mm,
write very differently, and I didn't think that I did that either.
mhm.
Until you know what I mean? Until you started getting those reviews. So, but I think a lot that we do and don't do as far as our careers, our environment, you know what I mean? Make our worlds, our surround our writing, create us as writers. And
Yes.
since I believe that you're an analyst currently, right?
That's the day job, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So by day, you're an analyst. By night, you're a writer. Do you find, and when we're talking about these worlds that we're creating, do you
Mhm.
find that your analytic skills intersect with your creative process? I mean, can you share an example of that if that's possible?
Sort of. Like, I think for one, I think being the analytic skills come more into play when I'm editing versus when I'm writing.
Mhm.
But at the same time, I think what that sort of like that analyst brain really helps me learn things intuitively. So, for an example, when I did decide to write that romance, I went and I just binged a whole bunch of cheesy romance movies on Netflix. Like, that's the only thing I watched for a solid 2 weeks. But that was enough for me to kind of pick out, this is the patterns of a romance. These are the things that you're seeing. These are the tropes. I tend to internalize and pick things like that pretty easy. And that then translates when I'm starting a brand new story. I'm like, okay, well, I know I want this type of story or this type of mood. For example, I want a story that's okay, this is a rag to riches, for example. Or I really want the story to be about someone overcoming loss. And having consumed other media like that, my brain has been able to pick out like, okay, this is what I liked about these other stories. Here's how I think it can replicate it. And then I can put that in my first draft, and then my brain can go back and be like, oh, okay, let's try this edit and that edit and this edit. So I think that's where it comes into play. I will admit sometimes though it is also I step away from that part of my life and I try to put up a wall because specifically I am a marketing analyst
Mhm.
and that means I should be really good at marketing my stuff and I'm not. Because I do also try to say this is work things and this is pleasure, fun things, writing. But so sometimes there is that sort of mental block that I purposely put there.
Mhm.
But I don't, like, I'm not a plotter. So I'm not building the Excels, this and this and this and this and this. I think it's
Mm.
just helping me instinctively know how something works when I'm absorbing all of this other media that I'm consuming, be it movies
Well,
or songs or books.
right. Now, I'm gonna be honest with you, Gwen, the mirror just shattered when you said that you were good at editing.
And I wouldn't necessarily say I'm good at editing. I will be blunt and I don't do a lot of editing. Most of my editing is adding more details. So let's say I want to go in and I want to be clear about my character's motivations, or I want to
Mhm.
add more sensory details. So I'll add all of those little things, but it's very rare that I will make big structural edits because I feel like I'm already there. I do tend to get very picky in terms of word choice and selection because I do believe that certain words will have certain moods and evocations. The other thing is I want to like, and this might be kind of that analytical mind is like, okay, well, if my character is a musician, I only want to use metaphors that use music terms. So I can just kind of build that connection between the prose and the character and then the reader who's consuming it. So, but other than that, like, maybe I probably should edit more. I usually just and that's maybe one of the benefits and some things about being an indie author is you have something and you could just send it out into the world. I do edit, but I also like indie authors, right? Like editors are expensive. So I'm very
Mm.
reliant on my own skills and the skills of my writers group to help me figure things out. And there's just always going to be limitations to that.
Yeah, I don't think we've talked about that a lot here on the
Mm.
podcast with many of the authors. I've been doing this for, oh, what are we, Laura? Are we over 3 years now? I think we're over 3 years. I think we're on our 4th year. But, through our whole, depth of this every time because generally my circle are authors. I mean, I've drifted here and there on different topics just because the world is changing around us, but the core of my guests are always authors. So, typically, we've talked about that to extent about the expense of editing, and then there's the book covers, and it can be very pricey, and I don't think readers understand that we only make about 33 cents for every 99 cents you sell.
Right,
And
depending
mhm,
on how it works out. I think the cheapest I've ever published a book was $200.
yeah.
Um, but and then it takes like you have to sell a lot of copies to make that back. I'm actually a little nervous because in June I will be attending a local author fair, but it is the first one not sponsored by a library, and thus I have paid a booth fee. And so we'll
Mm.
see if I can make that back.
My my first book, I put, I think, what was it, 12K into,
Yeah.
and but I had a graphic designer, I had a editor, I had all of that. And sometimes with the editor, I lost a lot of my voice, and then I had to go back in and redo stuff because it felt like the book was no longer mine. Because there was questions about the character, like, I would be getting things from the editor, be like, "Are you sure this person this doesn't sound like what she would do?" And I'm like, "Yo, who wrote this?" So, I think it's a give and take. I will never stand back and say that I am the best editor because I am not. But Laura knows that. Laura has edited with me, and I am the worst. And I love Laura to no end, but sometimes when Laura sends me stuff with red pins on it, I'm like, "You don't know me. You don't know me.
Oh, well,
You don't know how she would."
for sure, editing is hard, and editing is a different
Mhm.
skill than writing, I would
Yes.
argue. There's so many things that go into it, like, you there's one, the ability to dissect a piece, right? Do you know can you tell that something is wrong? And 2, can you tell and then do you actually know what that specific issue is? What makes it feel wrong, and what would be a possible solution to fix it? Like, those are skills that you need to develop. But then there's also the communication, right? Like, to your point, if your editors that you've worked with in the past feel pushy or heavy-handed and they make you feel like you have to do this, that's probably not a good editor, right? Because you don't want to have your voice taken over. You really just want an editor to help you do what you want better, which does require a lot of communication because especially I think sometimes in like critique groups or online critique groups especially, right? Like let's I used to use Critique Circle a lot. There's usually not a lot of back and forth. And so an editor
Mm,
might be looking at your work in isolation. They don't know what you're trying to do, which can
right.
cause
I
some
agree with
problems.
that. I agree with that. I did get the biggest compliment from again, from my very first book. It was only 15,000 words, so keep that in mind,
Mhm.
but and I put 12K into this book. I just wanna put that out there.
Yeah.
But the thing about the first book was, because, like I said, the graphic designer was fantastic, worth every penny. And the editor, I don't wanna put her down because she wrote me this fantastic letter, and she told me, and this was my first book published ever. She told me in such a short book, because you know how we talk about those laws in books where you and I both said we would rather be tight and get all the information
Yeah.
in without being get this lengthy, detailed. And she said that I did the fabulous job that she had ever seen in her life. That I'm building myself up with this compliment, but
It's all good. Like, right, you should
yeah.
promote yourself.
Yeah, well, that was the biggest thing that I got from her was that she said for the shorter content that I had and I didn't have any laws and that I did a very good job bringing like, when you go back into the past, I brought it up into the context of the story, so you didn't have chapters about past details. And that was memorable. That part I loved, even when, Laura's edited me, and the feedback in a positive way is great. I mean, you get that is the biggest high, but it's the you know what I mean? It's the red pen. You know what I mean? That just I'm not good at editing at all. So,
Yeah, fair. I'm a
aside from
very harsh editor. I try not to do it because I'm not very good at that communication side of it. I will admit that.
I did have a brief skit at being someone's ghostwriter, and I did truly love
Ooh.
that. Oh,
I've
I know,
always
it
been
was like,
curious about, like, maybe doing
oh,
that.
the most fun I've ever had is rewriting somebody, and I was asked to do it, so it wasn't like you're doing it as an insult, you know what I mean? You were
Huh.
rewriting someone, and that was fantastic, and he absolutely loved it. His was a true story, but
Yeah.
still, I really loved being able to touch base with that. But as we talk about things that influences, you travel quite a bit, yes?
Yes. I'm a big travel nerd.
So as you travel, does that inspire your writing? I mean, could you
Oh, very, very often. And at this point, I've been a lot of places. So and the things that inspire me Very, right? So it could be local legends. Like that's something that I really do like to do is if possible buy like books about local fairy tales or urban legends. And I slowly have been building a collection of that. Sometimes it's just using the people that I met on vacation as a basis for a character.
Mm.
So that's kind of what I'm doing right now with the most recent Chicago's Grimm is my most recent trip was to Colombia. So my protagonist is a Colombian woman.
Ah.
Um, and then the nonfiction pen name that I have has actually published travel logs. So then I'm actually physically turning my trips into narratives. In part because then they're just like, to be frank, like fancy travel diaries of like, okay, I'm not gonna forget. Um, but they're also ways for me to kind of pick at myself, if that makes sense, because
Mm.
you learn things when you travel. You're learning about different cultures and you're making those connections and you're doing the comparisons. And that's kind of my analyst brain too, right? So like
Mhm.
I'm in one town, I'm like, oh, this is like this town, or isn't this really interesting how this relates to the American culture? That's so fascinating. And stuff like that and thoughts like that will show up in my travel logs. So definitely inspired. It's just so cool. One day I will write a story based off of
I'm losing
so
you a
like,
little bit, Gwen. Are you
oh
still with
no,
me?
I am. But as I'm looking out the window, I'm seeing storm call crowds move in. So that might be it.
Okay.
Right. But yes. So in sum, yes, I'm very inspired by my travels and I love to travel.
I can understand that. I don't travel as much anymore, but when I used to, I'd love to sit in the airports and listen to dialect and then make some notes
Ooh.
and write it down. I found that interesting. The
Dialect
best
like the
place.
words that they're using or their accent?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, accents, wordage, how they pronunciate it. I found it very interesting. It just and then I would start to write characters from that and just make notes, things that I would wanna use in a book or Pacific. And then I guess you could cause it like just sitting back and doing a little bit of stalking from people. You know what I mean? Not really anyone in particular, just listening and stalking conversations around me and making notations. I found that very interesting. I
Oh.
think just sitting in a place, well, pretty much like an airport, which again, I haven't done this in a while, but just sitting back and listening because that is just the port of all kinds of languages and information passing you all at once. And I found it very interesting.
Yeah. Any place where you're surrounded by other people, there's
Mhm.
just so much for you to look at. The dialect, but also like clothing and behavior. I feel
Yes.
like I used to do that a lot as a teen. We would just go to the park and we would make up stories about people. We often
Mhm.
couldn't hear what they were saying, but we could pick up on their body languages. We could judge their clothing, and from there, right? So we'd be like, "Oh, you're a skater because you're wearing baggy jeans or whatever, and you obviously just look like a babysitter trying to handle a kid." But it's just that sort of you just get inspiration from everywhere, and getting
Well,
inspiration
yes.
from people, I think, is really rich because they're full of stories themselves.
True. So as the publishing world is constantly evolving, what trends or changes in the industry have caught your attention lately, and how do you adapt them as an independent author?
Oh, you to ask me a hard question. Um,
Sorry.
no, it's fine. So I think, I mean, the big one, right, is AI, which I can see the usefulness of it, and I have used it in the past, but I actually haven't used it for like 3 years. So
Mhm,
I used it way back before like ChatGPT or OpenAI was around. There used to be that
mhm,
app called Starry AI, which
mhm,
I used to create one of my book covers. And that same book, I actually used Google's voice model to develop a audiobook. But I haven't used it since because generative AI, there's a lot of concerns around the ethics of it, the
mhm.
environmentalness of it. It's very polarizing. So I haven't used it since that one project, which at this point got published in 2022. So it truly has been a while since I've used AI
Right.
in writing. But I keep thinking about it because I had actually listened to a different podcast, sorry, about writers, but the guy was explaining different ways that he had used AI in terms of translations and generating his
Mm,
covers, and he's actually done tests for his audiobooks. Did people like the AI narration or not? And people would always leave not so nice comments on the AI version, but
mhm.
he actually got more consumption and revenue from the AI version. And I
Yeah.
was like, "Oh, that's kind of interesting," especially using AI for translation, because again, that's one of those things that doesn't really that's expensive, and it's not like I haven't been using some variation of AI for decades, right? That's what essentially what runs spell check. So,
Well, yeah. Well,
you know?
Word Microsoft Word has it in it now, you know what I mean? That cap the cap, whatever they're calling it now.
Yeah.
I
Um,
personally,
mhm.
I like the AI as far as where it comes to my editing. We've already established I suck at it, and so this way it highlights for me and lets me know where there's a problem with the sentence structure or a problem with, you know what I mean, the commas here or an asterisk here, you know what I mean? Stuff like
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
So
sure.
I do use it for that. And sometimes I won't get my point across. Now, I only use the AI after I've written a book, okay? And I
Yeah.
only go in to edit. I don't use it to write my books. I
See, I
use it
find that
to edit.
hilarious, Ari, because I have a like a lifetime pro subscription to Pro Writing Aid, and ever since they've
Mhm.
been incorporating AI elements to it, I've actually been using it less and less because I don't
Oh.
think it's good at editing. But I think what is happening, to like your earlier point about editors, I feel
Mhm.
like the suggestions that I'm getting from the AI are counterintuitive for what I'm trying to do. Like, I wrote the
Mm.
sentence purposefully, or it's suggesting edits that I don't actually think are needed. But I
Right.
know I
It
also don't all I specifically sometimes don't use correct grammar as a stylistic
uh
choice, so that doesn't help.
You now you're speaking my language.
Right? I tend to
Yeah.
skip, oh, like, transition words, right? So I'll do, like,
Mhm.
a list, and I have no "and." It's just
Yeah.
this and this and this. I tend to do a lot of skipped or understood subjects, which AI tends to have a problem with. So, like, I'll still use it for spelling, but
Yeah.
for some
Well,
basic stuff, I just don't anymore.
let me tell you an example of how I use it. I look at it as a tool, not as a co-writer, okay? I
Mhm.
use it just as a tool. I've also even different programs like Amazon and Draft to Digital will ask you if you wanna be a part of the AI component where they're learning from your writing, and I always say, "No, absolutely not for mine. I wanna stay as unique as possible, even if a lot of people hate me, that's fine. I'll own that." But what I do like it as is, like, I have a tendency like, if I find a word that I just absolutely adore, and I will do it unconsciously, I will write it more like, you'll see it just pop up and pop up and pop up and pop up, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so, I can put that into whatever AI format, and I use several. I don't use them as an AI per se, I mean, like, in the documents of the editing or whatever you know what I mean? Whatever thing I'm using at the time. And I can highlight that and look at different ways to get the same meaning either through sentence reconstruction or doing, you know what I mean, finding words of similar,
Yeah.
you know what I mean, meaning.
Um,
So I like it in that sense, only because I know me as a writer, I have a problem that when I write, I understand what I'm trying to say. Okay.
mhm,
And I also use the AI in this sense. When I have a process, and I've been doing this long since I realized they started to do it, but now because of AI, it's more in depth.
mhm.
I like the book to be read back to me, and I usually take print copies. I'll go to a publish one of the things that publish a bunch of documents for you, and I'll print the book out, sit in front of the Word, Microsoft Word, or whatever program I'm using. Like I said, I've used Barry, and I would give you a list of names, but I'll have to go through my browser to do it. But I like it to read to me
Mm,
as I'm following along, and then I'll highlight. I'll be my own red pen. Good gosh gracious, I can't even say I'm saying that aloud. But anyways, I'll go through and I will red pen myself. And that is how I use it. I use it just simply for my editing tools. And I know this about myself because when I'm writing, I take for granted that I perceive and understand, but I might not give enough details for the reader to understand where I'm coming from. Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah,
it's a even from my characters, I might know this back history that I've made, but I have not wrote, you know what I mean? I have not put it in this book about my character. And so that when I'm doing that, it helps me understand that I haven't done that. So I personally just like to use mine as a tool. I don't use it to write my books, but I do like it to help me edit. And just so it goes back to the comment that we already talked about how editors are they're expensive. And as an indie writer, you know what I'm saying? I don't have the money to put into that. I would have to take it from something else that I do to be able to do
yeah.
that.
Mm.
That bec
And that just becomes expensive and hard to do and
Yeah.
time consuming and a whole bunch of stuff.
Mhm.
But yeah, no, as an editing tool, like I said, I'm using editing tools less than I was before, and that might just because I'm getting more comfortable in my own writer's voice.
Hmm.
But
Yeah, I can see that.
what you had mentioned about looking for the different words, that is something that I still do in Pro Writing Aid. They have a feature actually, and I could
Mhm.
customize it. So it's like, okay, look for the same repeat within 20 words of each other or 40 words of each other, and then they'll highlight it. And then,
Right, and
yeah.
that's still sort of an AI, you know what I mean?
Oh,
That's
that's
still
definitely done
yeah.
by
Yeah.
AI. But
So
like
it just dep
AI
yeah,
is a buzzword at this point, right? It's really just an algorithm. It's applied statistics. It's
yeah.
what's happening is the
I
difference.
think it's based on your perception. I think,
Mhm.
because we know AI can write books now and can
Yes.
do a convincing enough job based on information put into it. So, I think for someone who wants to stay true to the craft, it's a very insult that you would use it. But I don't look at it to write my entire book. I bring my book to it and say,
Mhm.
"Hey, I'm looking for this, this, and this." And I'll have it read to me. And I'll be honest with you, I have, lately, Chat GPT is my therapist, man, I'm telling you. I can
Oh,
go to it and talk, and to be validated on my thoughts or my thinking is so important to me, it really is. And, but I've only started getting into Chat GPT, I said, till this year. And, only because the last few years I've had a lot of personal things. So it's been nice to actually sit down and put my thoughts on and not to be judged if you were going to talk with a friend or family, you know what I mean? When you put those out
mhm.
there, then you always have that. So it depends, I think it really depends on your aspects of it. But as I switch this back from
Oh,
AI,
it's all good.
you've contributed to both standalone works and anthologies.
Mhm.
How does your creative process dictate when writing a full-length book versus well, I know you said you write not quite novellas, your short stories, but how do they work as far as where it's for yourself and what you're doing in collaboration?
So it might be worth stepping back. Even when I've been in anthologies where I'm one contributing author, I'm usually actually still working independently. I'm
Mhm.
writing that story by myself, I'm editing that story by myself. So it's no different than my collections. So to separate it, an anthology is places where I'm one of 20 authors, or a collection is like all of those 20 stories are mine. It's still a short story that I'm writing in isolation, and then for anthologies, it's going through just the submission process. The most recent one that I went through with the small press, I was oh goodness, I should know the name of this. It was, written with pride, but it was one of those things is there was an open call for submissions, I wrote the story in isolation, I sent it to them, and that was that. So it's the same headspace, I would say. It gets a little different where recently actually helped edit an anthology. And then so in that
Mhm.
case, I'm actually having to work with other people. And the process that we went through for that anthology also was more of a workshop, so it involved authors critiquing each other's works. But there's still in that case, it's a little different because the where you're working together and not just thinking about stories individually is once you start to do the publishing side of things. What should the cover be like? What should the title be like? What should the order of the stories be? Which can be a little hard if you don't put that work in ahead of time, I would say,
Mhm.
especially if all of your stories aren't really tightly grouped in terms of theme. How are you gonna come up with a cover that because this was a struggle that we had, our stories were contemporary and historical and fantasy and science fiction, and what were we how are we supposed to do a cover for all of that?
Mm.
Um but we ended up just doing like a I don't wanna call it a piecemeal cover, but this was the first time I actually hired an artist was to do the cover for that. She just did different illustrations surrounding the title, which was a pretty good solution, I thought. But the actual writing is still the same in my headspace, whether it's a collection of my work or working with other authors.
Sorry, I had to mute myself. I just had 4 dogs come into a small booth.
Oh, you are fine.
I take it on that note, they're letting me know, "Mom, your podcast has went over your time."
I was gonna say, like, we are almost at an hour here. I'm like, "Oh, wow,
Yeah.
okay."
Well, normally, we do about 20 minutes, but I usually, if we have a good conversation, I just let it roll, and usually my guests, I've had them even text me like, "Yo, I need to get off here in a couple minutes." So that's fine. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Same.
Like I said, in a lot of ways, I felt like I was looking at a mirror, and again, I don't know if that's an insult or a compliment for you, but I'll
I
just
think
put
it's a
that out there.
compliment.
Oh, awesome, great. I wanna thank you for being a part of the show tonight. I think you gave a valuable input on how you write and what you go through as your process. So thank you so much for your time tonight.
Of course, thank you for having me on. It was really good talking to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you to our listeners. Until next time, bye-bye for now.